think about everything you learned in history class. Ancient Egypt, the pyramids, Mesopotamia, the Roman Empire, maybe some Greek philosophers if your teacher was feeling ambitious. Here's the thing though, modern humans, anatomically identical to you and me, have existed for over 300,000 years. But everything we call history, everything in those textbooks, only covers the last 5,000 years. That's less than 2% of our story. So where's the other 98%? What were humans doing for those missing 295,000 years? The answer is going to sound crazy. We don't really know. Not in the way we know about Julius Caesar or Cleopatra. There are no written records because writing hadn't been invented yet. No kingdoms to study because kingdoms didn't exist. No cities because nobody had built them. For most of human existence, we left almost nothing behind except some tools, some bones, and mysteries carved into cave walls that we're still trying to decode. This isn't ancient history. This is something deeper, something stranger. This is deep time, a scale so vast that civilizations rise and fall in what amounts to the blink of an eye. And for reasons nobody really understands, we barely talk about it. Here's what's wild. A person living 200,000 years ago had the same size brain as you, the same capacity for language, emotion, creativity, problem solving. They could have learned to use a smartphone if you handed them one and gave them time. They weren't primitive in the way we usually imagine. They were us, just living in a world before everything we take for granted existed. So what were they doing all that time? Just sitting around waiting to invent farming? That doesn't make sense. Humans are too curious, too creative, too restless. For 295,000 years, people were living full lives, raising children, telling stories, figuring out how to survive in environments that would kill most of us today. They were falling in love, making art, staring up at the same stars we see now, and wondering what it all meant. But we don't learn about them. In school, history starts with writing. Before that, it's just this vague blur called prehistory, as if nothing important happened, as if the story only starts when someone figured out how to press symbols into clay tablets. That's insane when you think about it. We spend weeks learning about the construction techniques of Egyptian pyramids, which are 4,500 years old. Impressive, absolutely. But we spend maybe one class period, if we're lucky, on the fact that humans were creating sophisticated art 40,000 years ago. Cave paintings so beautiful and technically skilled that when they were first discovered, scientists refused to believe ancient people could have made them. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what this is for. But before you drift off, do me a favour and drop a comment. Where are you right now? What time is it? I love checking in and seeing Berlin at sunrise, Tokyo at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all of us connected across time zones, learning about people who lived across eons, because that's what this is really about. Connection. The people we're going to talk about, they're not aliens, they're not some separate species. They're our great-great-great-grandparents, repeated about 10,000 times. And they did things that should be impossible. They crossed oceans without modern boats. They survived ice ages that turned most of Europe into an Arctic wasteland. They developed technologies we still don't fully understand. There's evidence they were performing complex surgical procedures 15,000 years ago. Evidence of long-distance trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Evidence of astronomical knowledge, mathematical concepts, sophisticated social structures. And here's the part that keeps archaeologists up at night. We probably only found a tiny fraction of what existed. Most traces of human activity from before 10,000 years ago have been erased by time. Wooden structures rotted away. Organic materials decomposed. Coastal settlements were swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. Entire chapters of human achievement just gone. So what you're about to hear isn't the complete story. It can't be. It's more like finding a few pages from a book that was thousands of volumes long. But even those fragments are enough to completely change how we understand human history. They reveal a story stranger, older, and more epic than anything in our history books. We're going back to the very beginning, before civilization, before agriculture, before everything. Back to when humans were just another species trying to survive on a planet that didn't care whether we made it or not. Back to the missing 295,000 years. This is the story we forgot. The story of what humans did before history began. Picture someone who looks exactly like you. Same height range, same basic body proportions, same skull shape. Put them in modern clothes and they could walk down any street in the world without attracting a second glance. Now imagine that person lived 300,000 years ago in Africa, in a world with no cities, no farms, no metal, no writing, no civilization of any kind. This is the paradox at the heart of human prehistory. Anatomically modern humans, people who look just like us, emerged somewhere in Africa around 300,000 years ago. But for the next 250,000 years, they lived in ways that would seem utterly alien to us. They weren't primitive versions of modern people. They were fully human, with the same cognitive potential we have, but they existed in a fundamentally different relationship with the world. The oldest fossils we've found come from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. The skulls show all the hallmarks of modern anatomy: high, rounded craniums, small, flat faces, the distinctive chin that sets Homo sapiens apart from every other human species. When anthropologists first dated these remains, they expected them to be maybe 200,000 years old, fitting neatly into the existing timeline. Instead, the dates came back at 315,000 years. The discovery pushed back the origin of our species by over 100,000 years, and it shattered the idea that modern humans emerged suddenly in one location. Because similar fossils started turning up across Africa, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Kenya. All roughly the same age, all showing that distinctive modern anatomy. This wasn't one population evolving in one place and then spreading. This was multiple populations across an entire continent, connected by networks of migration and gene flow, all evolving toward the same basic body plan. But here's what keeps anthropologists awake at night. Having a modern body doesn't automatically mean having a modern mind. Those early Homo sapiens, the ones from 300,000 years ago, they had brains the same size as ours. They had the same neural architecture. But were they thinking the same way we think? Were they capable of abstract reasoning, symbolic thought, the kind of consciousness that lets humans wonder about the meaning of existence? We don't know, and the uncertainty is maddening. The archaeological record from this early period is frustratingly sparse. Stone tools, yes. Evidence of hunting and gathering, yes, but nothing that screams modern human behaviour. No art, no symbols, no clear evidence of the kind of abstract thinking that defines human culture today. For over 100,000 years after anatomically modern humans appeared, the archaeological record looks almost identical to what Neanderthals and other human species were producing. Same basic tool types, same subsistence strategies, same apparent lack of symbolic behaviour. This created one of the biggest debates in anthropology. Did modern anatomy emerge first, with modern behaviour following much later? Or did our ancestors always have the capacity for complex thought, but only started expressing it archaeologically when conditions were right? The first hints of something different start appearing around 200,000 years ago. At a site called Pinnacle Point in South Africa, archaeologists found evidence of systematic ochre processing. Ochre is a natural clay coloured with iron oxide ranging from yellow to deep red, and humans have been obsessed with it for hundreds of thousands of years. But why? You can't eat it. It doesn't make better tools. The only explanation that makes sense is symbolic. They were using it for decoration, for ritual, for marking bodies or objects as special. Then, around 100,000 years ago, the evidence gets stronger. Shell beads start appearing, carefully perforated for stringing. These aren't just pretty objects, they're symbols of identity. When you wear a bead, you're making a statement about who you are, what group you belong to, what status you hold. This is abstract thinking, the ability to invest objects with meaning beyond their physical properties. But the real game changer is burial. The first clear evidence of intentional burial by Homo sapiens appears around 100,000 years ago. Not just bodies covered with dirt, but deliberate graves, bodies positioned carefully, sometimes with objects placed alongside them. This is consciousness confronting mortality. This is humans who understood that death was permanent, who felt the need to mark that transition with ritual. Think about what that means. Someone dies, and instead of just leaving the body where it fell, the group stops everything. They dig a hole, a task that takes hours with primitive tools. They arrange the body carefully. Maybe they say words, perform rituals, express grief in ways we can only imagine. Then they cover the grave and remember where it is. This requires abstract thought, emotional complexity, the ability to conceive of existence and non-existence. Were they wondering about the stars yet? When did a human first look up at the night sky and ask why? We'll never know exactly, but burial suggests they were already asking the big questions. What happens after death? Why are we here? What does it all mean? These weren't simple survival behaviours. These were the first stirrings of philosophy, religion, art, the emergence of the full human experience. But here's where the story gets complicated. Our ancestors weren't alone. Between 300,000 and 40,000 years ago, Earth was home to at least 5 different human species, all living simultaneously, all competing for the same resources, all capable of sophisticated behaviour. The Neanderthals had Europe and Western Asia. They were manufacturing complex tools, hunting Ice Age megafauna, creating the first systematic burial practices. Some evidence suggests they were using pigments, possibly creating cave art, definitely engaging in symbolic behaviour. They weren't primitive brutes, they were humans, just a different branch of the human family tree. The Denisovans controlled huge swaths of Asia. We know less about them because we've found fewer fossils, just a handful of teeth and bone fragments from a cave in Siberia. But their DNA is everywhere. Modern populations from Tibet to New Guinea carry Denisovan genes, evidence that our ancestors encountered them and interbred with them across thousands of miles and thousands of years. Then there were others, Homo naledi in South Africa, with their strange mixture of primitive and modern features. Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, the so-called hobbits, standing barely a metre tall but capable of making sophisticated stone tools. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, known from a few fossils but representing yet another human lineage that survived into the age of Homo sapiens. All of these species were human in the broader sense. All had large brains, made tools, used fire, probably had language of some kind, and they all overlapped with us in time and space. Our ancestors knew they existed. They encountered them, competed with them, sometimes fought them, sometimes mated with them. This is profoundly different from how we usually think about human evolution. We imagine a linear progression, one species evolving into the next in a neat chain leading to us. But the reality was messy, chaotic, beautiful. Multiple human species, all experimenting with different survival strategies, all developing their own unique adaptations and cultures. The question that haunts researchers is simple but unanswerable. What made Homo sapiens different? Why did we survive when all the others went extinct? Why are we the last human species standing? It wasn't intelligence. Neanderthals had bigger brains than we did. It wasn't tool-making ability. Other species created tools just as sophisticated as ours. It wasn't even symbolic thinking. The evidence suggests multiple human species were capable of abstract thought. Maybe it was social organization. Some anthropologists think Homo sapiens developed larger, more flexible social networks. While Neanderthals lived in small bands of 30 or 40, maybe our ancestors formed coalitions of hundreds, trading information and resources across vast distances. These networks would have provided resilience, allowing knowledge and innovations to spread rapidly. Or maybe it was language. Not just communication, which other species certainly had, but true syntactic language with infinite generative capacity. The ability to express abstract concepts, tell stories about the past and future, share complex information with precision. If our ancestors developed language even slightly more sophisticated than other species, that advantage would compound over time. Or maybe, and this is the humbling possibility, maybe it was just luck. Maybe we survived not because we were superior, but because we happened to be in the right places when climate disasters hit, or because random chance favored our populations during critical bottlenecks. The fossil record is full of species that were wildly successful until they weren't. Dominance guarantees nothing. What we know for certain is this. By 70,000 years ago, something had changed. The archaeological record shifts dramatically. Suddenly we see an explosion of sophisticated behavior, elaborate tools, long-distance trade networks, musical instruments, sophisticated art, complex burial practices. Everything that defines modern human culture appears within a few thousand years. Anthropologists call this the cognitive revolution, though the name is misleading. It wasn't that human cognition suddenly improved. The hardware was already there, had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, something unlocked the software. Maybe language reached a critical threshold of complexity. Maybe population density increased enough that innovations could spread and accumulate. Maybe a genetic mutation affected brain development in subtle but important ways. Or maybe nothing changed at all. Maybe the capacity was always there, waiting, and we only see it archaeologically when population sizes and preservation conditions finally made it visible. The absence of evidence, after all, is not evidence of absence. By 60,000 years ago, our ancestors were ready. They had the bodies, the brains, the social systems, and the technologies to do something no human species had done before. They were about to leave Africa and conquer the entire planet. But the world they were walking into wasn't empty. It was full of other humans, other species, all adapted to their own territories, all ready to defend their resources. The age of human diversity was ending. The age of Homo sapiens dominance was about to begin. But first they had to survive a journey into the unknown, carrying nothing but stone tools, fire, and the accumulated knowledge of 250,000 years of human experience. Let's destroy some myths right now. When you picture a Stone Age human, what do you see? Probably some brutish, grunting creature huddled in a cave, barely surviving, living a short, nasty, violent life. The classic caveman stereotype: half ape, half human, more animal than person. That image? Completely wrong. Dangerously wrong, actually, because it prevents us from understanding who these people really were. The humans living 50,000 years ago weren't primitive versions of us. They were us. Same brain capacity, same cognitive abilities, same emotional complexity. Drop a baby from that era into a modern family and they'd grow up indistinguishable from anyone else. They'd learn to read, use smartphones, understand calculus. The hardware was identical. Only the software, the accumulated cultural knowledge, was different. But here's what really matters. In many ways, they were better adapted to their world than we are to ours. They possessed knowledge systems so sophisticated, so finely tuned to their environments, that modern scientists spend careers trying to reconstruct tiny fragments of what every hunter-gatherer child learned before adolescence. So what was daily life actually like for your ancestors 50,000 years ago? Let's walk through a typical day. Not speculation, but based on decades of archaeological evidence and careful observation of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the modern era. You wake up as the sun rises, not because you have an alarm clock, but because your circadian rhythm is perfectly synchronized with natural light cycles. You've slept around 9 hours, maybe more in winter, curled against your family for warmth. Your sleep was interrupted several times during the night, which is normal. Nobody slept in one continuous 8-hour block until the industrial era invented that pattern. You'd wake, tend the fire, check on children, talk quietly with others, then drift back to sleep. The first task is breakfast. But here's where things get interesting. You're not desperate for food. You're not starving. Archaeological analysis of hunter-gatherer skeletons shows they were generally well-nourished, often healthier than early agricultural populations. There's food from yesterday, nuts and dried meat, maybe some berries. You eat enough to feel satisfied, then begin the day's work. And here's the shocking part. That work, it takes maybe 3 to 5 hours. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers have documented this consistently. The Dok Kung people of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, indigenous Australian groups. All of them worked dramatically less than modern humans. They'd spend a few hours gathering plant foods or hunting, then the rest of the day was leisure. Socializing, playing with children, making art, telling stories, napping, having sex. This is what anthropologist Marshall Salins called the original affluent society. Not because they had lots of stuff, but because they easily satisfied their material needs with minimal work, then spent the rest of their time doing things they actually enjoyed. Think about that. Your ancestors 50,000 years ago probably worked fewer hours than you do. They had more free time than most modern people. More time for friends, for family, for creativity, for rest. Now, the work they did do was skilled labour. Gathering plant foods wasn't just picking whatever looked edible. It required encyclopedic knowledge of hundreds of plant species, which parts were edible, and when. How to process toxic plants to make them safe, where different species grew in different seasons, how weather patterns affected availability. A skilled gatherer, usually but not exclusively women, could look at a landscape and see what modern eyes would miss entirely. That patch of unremarkable grass. It has edible roots 3 feet underground. Those trees, their inner bark is nutritious in late winter when nothing else is available. That flowering plant, its seeds won't be ready for another 2 weeks, but mark the location and return then. This knowledge was detailed, precise, scientific in everything but name. It had to be. Mistakes could kill you. Confuse one plant species with a toxic look-alike and you'd die in agony. Miss the seasonal timing and you'd go hungry. Hunting required equally sophisticated knowledge. Tracking an animal across varied terrain, interpreting days-old signs to reconstruct its behavior, understanding animal psychology well enough to predict movements, knowing which hunting techniques worked for which species in which conditions. The best hunters weren't just strong or fast, they were naturalists, ecologists, applied psychologists. They understood their prey better than most modern. Biologists understand laboratory animals. They could predict where a herd would be 3 days from now based on weather patterns, vegetation growth and seasonal behavior. And they didn't hunt alone. Cooperative hunting was the norm. Groups of hunters working together using elaborate communication, sometimes spanning hours or days, driving game toward ambush points, coordinating movements across miles. This required language, planning, trust, and leadership, all the cognitive abilities that supposedly distinguish modern humans. But what about their health? Here's where the evidence gets really interesting. Pre-agricultural humans were, on average, healthier than their farming descendants. Skeletons don't lie. Hunter-gatherer remains show less tooth decay, less bone disease, better overall nutrition than early farmers. They were taller too. Average height dropped significantly when humans adopted agriculture, then didn't recover until the 20th century. Your Paleolithic ancestors were likely taller than your grandparents, possibly taller than you. They had fewer infectious diseases because they lived in small groups that moved frequently. Epidemic diseases required dense, settled populations to sustain themselves. Hunter-gatherers were too mobile, too dispersed. A disease might kill one band but wouldn't spread further. Now, life wasn't perfect. Injury was dangerous. A broken leg could mean death if you couldn't keep up when the band moved. Childhood mortality was significant, though not as catastrophic as often claimed. But if you survived to adulthood, you had a decent chance of living into your 60s or 70s. Not the everyone died at 30 myth you've probably heard. The social structure was radically different from anything most modern people experience. These bands, typically 20 to 50 people, were profoundly egalitarian. Not because they had noble philosophies about equality, but because inequality was impossible to maintain. You can't accumulate wealth when you're constantly moving. You can't dominate others when survival depends on cooperation. You can't claim ownership of land when your whole territory spans hundreds of miles and you share it with neighboring bands. Leadership existed, but it was fluid, situational. The best hunter might lead during a hunt. The most knowledgeable elder might guide decisions about moving camp. The most skilled healer would direct medical care. But nobody ruled. Nobody commanded. Authority came from competence, not position. This created what anthropologists call a sharing economy, not because people were selfless saints, but because sharing was the only rational strategy. Kill a large animal, and you can't possibly eat it all before it spoils. No refrigeration, remember? So you share it with the whole band, knowing that when someone else makes a kill, they'll share with you. This extended beyond food. Knowledge was shared freely. Tool-making techniques, hunting strategies, medicinal plant knowledge. Hoarding information would be absurd when everyone's survival depended on the collective knowledge base. Children grew up in this communal environment. They weren't raised by just their parents, but by the entire band. Multiple adults caring for them, teaching them, protecting them. This is called alloparenting, and it's probably the ancestral human condition. The isolated nuclear family is the weird modern innovation, not the communal child-rearing of our ancestors. And they were teaching these children sophisticated knowledge systems that took years to master. How to read landscapes, understand animal behavior, process foods, make tools, treat illnesses, navigate by stars, predict weather, maintain social relationships. This was education, as rigorous as anything in a modern school, just conducted through apprenticeship and practice rather than formal instruction. Plant medicine alone represents an astonishing intellectual achievement. Hunter-gatherers knew which plants reduced fever, which treated infections, which eased pain. They understood that willow bark contains the compound we now call aspirin, that certain molds have antibiotic properties, that specific plants could induce abortion or ease childbirth. This wasn't superstition. This was pharmacology. developed through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. They were doing science. They just weren't writing it down. So why did this lifestyle persist for over 200,000 years? Why did it work so well for so long? Because it was sustainable. Hunter-gatherers existed in relative balance with their ecosystems. They weren't passive victims of nature. They shaped their environments through controlled burning, selective harvesting, even proto-agriculture in some regions. But they didn't deplete resources faster than they could regenerate, because it was adaptable. When conditions changed, hunter-gatherers could move, shift their diet, adjust their strategies. They weren't locked into one way of life the way farmers would be, dependent on specific crops and specific territories, because it was, in a very real sense, affluent, not materially wealthy but satisfied, needs met without grinding labour, time for rest, for creativity, for human connection. But it was also limiting. Band size stayed small because larger groups couldn't maintain the egalitarian sharing economy. Technology advanced slowly because innovation was local and knowledge transfer between distant groups was limited. Population density stayed low because the hunter-gatherer lifestyle couldn't support more people per square mile. These weren't stupid constraints. These were features of a successful adaptation. For 200,000 years, this was the human condition. This was the life that shaped our psychology, our social instincts, our fundamental nature. When agriculture finally emerged around 10,000 years ago, it didn't replace hunter-gathering because it was obviously better. Early farmers worked harder, ate worse, and died younger than their hunter-gatherer neighbours. But agriculture supported denser populations, and eventually numbers won. Still, we carry the hunter-gatherer blueprint in our minds and bodies. Our craving for variety in diet, our need for social connection, our ability to learn complex skills through observation, our egalitarian instincts that make us uncomfortable with extreme inequality. Understanding this isn't just academic. It's about recognizing what kind of creature you actually are, what your mind and body were designed for, and why modern life sometimes feels so profoundly wrong. Your ancestors weren't primitive. They were sophisticated, knowledgeable, and in many ways free in ways we've forgotten how to be. Picture yourself descending into a cave in southwestern France. Not a modern tourist cave with electric lights and handrails, but a narrow passage discovered by accident in 1940 when a teenager's dog fell through a hole in the ground. You squeeze through the entrance, your torch casting shadows on rough stone walls. You crawl forward through passages barely wide enough for your shoulders, and then the tunnel opens up. The walls explode with life. Horses gallop across the ceiling. Bulls charge through painted meadows. Deer leap and twist in impossible grace. The animals seem to move in the flickering torchlight, muscles rippling, heads turning to watch you as you pass. The paintings cover everything, layered over each other in some places, carefully spaced in others. This isn't random graffiti. This is art. Sophisticated, intentional, breathtaking art. Welcome to Lascaux, one of the most extraordinary art galleries ever created, and it's 17,000 years old. But here's what makes your head spin. Lascaux isn't even the oldest. Not by a long shot. The Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings dated to 36,000 years ago. The lions and rhinoceros and bears painted on those walls are nearly twice as old as Lascaux. Some hand stencils found in caves in Indonesia date back 39,900 years, and there's growing evidence that the creative explosion actually started even earlier, maybe 50,000 years ago or more. For context, the Great Pyramid of Giza is 4,500 years old. The cave paintings at Chauvet are 8 times older than the pyramids. 8 times. These artists were separated from ancient Egypt by more time than ancient Egypt is separated from us. Think about that for a second. When Egyptian pharaohs were building monuments to their gods, the paintings in Chauvet Cave were already ancient history, incomprehensibly old, as distant to them as they are to us. And yet, if you look at those paintings today, if you really study them, you see something that stops your breath. They're not primitive, they're not crude approximations or simple stick figures, they're masterpieces. The horses at Lascaux show shading and perspective. The artist understood how to create the illusion of three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. They mixed pigments to create different colours, reds and yellows and blacks made from iron oxides, manganese and charcoal. They used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals volume and movement. A bulge in the rock becomes the shoulder of a bison. A crack transforms into the leg of a horse. At Chauvet, the technique is even more sophisticated. Artists use stumping, blending charcoal with their fingers or tools to create soft shadows and highlights. They showed animals in motion, legs positioned to suggest running or fighting. They understood overlapping, painting one animal behind another to create depth. These weren't lucky accidents. This was technique. Skill developed over years, maybe decades, passed down from master to apprentice across generations. The aurochs bulls at Altamira in Spain, painted around 14,000 years ago, used the ceiling's natural bumps and hollows so effectively that the animals seemed to breathe. Stand beneath them with a flickering lamp, the way the original artists did, and the paintings come alive. The cattle shift and move. The effect is so powerful that when the paintings were first discovered in 1879, scientists refused to believe they were genuine. Nothing that old could be that good, except it was. But here's where the mystery deepens. Why? Why did they do this? These weren't doodles scratched during idle moments. Creating these paintings required enormous effort. The caves go deep, hundreds of feet into the earth, through passages that are cold, dark, and dangerous. The artist had to bring in materials, pigments ground from minerals, animal fat for lamps, scaffolding to reach the high ceilings. At Lascaux, there's evidence they built wooden platforms to paint the upper galleries. They had to prepare the cave walls, sometimes scraping them clean, mix their paints to exactly the right consistency. Work by firelight, or the dim glow of stone lamps burning animal fat, which gives maybe 1/10 the light of a candle. This wasn't casual. This was deliberate, systematic, important. But important for what? The standard answer is ritual, hunting magic. The theory goes that by painting the animals, prehistoric humans believed they could control them, ensure successful hunts, maybe even influence the animals' movements and behaviour. Paint the bison, catch the bison. It's elegant, it makes sense, and it might be completely wrong. Because here's the thing, many of the animals painted in these caves weren't primary food sources. At Chauvet, the walls are dominated by dangerous carnivores, lions and cave bears and rhinoceros. These weren't animals our ancestors hunted regularly. The archaeological evidence shows they mostly ate reindeer and horses, but those animals are far less common in the cave art. If this was hunting magic, they were doing it wrong. Some researchers think the caves were sacred spaces, temples where shamans conducted rituals and initiations. The deepest chambers, the ones requiring the most dangerous climbs and squeezes, might have been used for vision quests or coming-of-age ceremonies. Imagine being a teenager 20,000 years ago, crawling through absolute darkness, squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for your body, finally emerging into a hidden chamber where the walls explode with painted animals. That would mark you, change you, make you understand you were part of something ancient and powerful. Others suggest the paintings were storytelling, maps of migration routes and hunting territories, records of important events, teaching tools to pass knowledge to the next generation. The paintings do cluster in specific areas, almost like chapters in a book. Maybe they were meant to be read in sequence, telling stories we can no longer understand. But maybe, just maybe, they did it for the same reason artists do anything. Because they had to. Because something in them needed to create. Because they looked at a blank wall and saw horses running, bulls charging, deer leaping, and they couldn't rest until they brought that vision into the world. Stand in front of those paintings, really look at them, and you feel the presence of the artist, not as an abstract prehistoric human, but as an individual, someone who stood exactly where you're standing, who lifted their hand, touched pigment to stone, and left part of themselves behind. Someone who had hopes and fears and dreams and frustrations. Someone who saw beauty in the world and wanted to capture it, preserve it, share it. And sometimes they left more direct evidence, handprints, hundreds of them, scattered across cave walls from France to Indonesia to Argentina. The technique is simple. Place your hand flat against the wall, blow pigment around it, probably through a hollow bone or reed. Remove your hand. What's left is a negative image, a stencil, a ghost of your presence. These handprints are haunting. Touch one, place your hand directly over the print, and you're connecting with someone across 30,000 years. Your palm rests where their palm rested. Your fingers align with their fingers. The size tells you things. Small hands, probably women or adolescents. Some prints show missing fingers, possibly from frostbite or ritual amputation. One cave in Argentina has the handprints of an adult and a child, side by side, as if a parent and child stood together to mark their presence. They're saying something, these handprints. Maybe just, I was here. The simplest, most human impulse imaginable. The same reason people carve initials in trees or write their names in wet concrete. The desire to leave a mark, to be remembered, to matter. But cave paintings weren't the only art form. Portable art exploded during the same period. Carved figurines appear in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago. The Venus of Hohlfels, found in Germany, is carved from mammoth ivory and dates to about 35,000 years ago. It's tiny, fits in your palm, but the detail is extraordinary. Exaggerated female features, carefully incised details, polish from being handled repeatedly. This was something precious, something carried and treasured. Similar figurines appear across Europe. The Venus of Willendorf, the Venus of Lespugue, the Venus of Brassempouy, all showing similar stylistic choices, emphasizing fertility and femininity. Were these religious idols, fertility symbols, portable representations of a goddess? Or were they something simpler, representations of specific individuals, prehistoric portraits carried by people far from home? Tools become art too. Spear points carefully napped, not just for function, but for beauty. Bone needles decorated with geometric patterns. Pendants carved from shells and teeth. Someone spent hours creating decorative beading on a leather pouch that would last maybe a few years before wearing out. That's not survival. That's aesthetics. That's caring about beauty even when life is hard. And they made music. Bone flutes appear in the archaeological record about 40,000 years ago. These aren't simple whistles. They're sophisticated instruments with multiple holes capable of producing different notes. The Divya Babe flute, made from a cave bear femur, might be 50,000 years old, though its authenticity is debated. Later flutes, like those found at Geissenklösterle in Germany, are unquestionably instruments, carefully crafted with precisely placed holes that produce a musical scale. Imagine that sound. A flute carved from bird bone played in a firelit cave 35,000 years ago. What songs did they play? Lullabies, hunting songs, mourning songs for the dead. The music is gone, lost forever. But the instruments remain, silent testimony that our ancestors didn't just survive, they sang. They probably danced too. Some cave paintings seem to show figures in motion, possibly dancers. Archaeological sites show areas that might have been cleared for performances, spaces with good acoustics where sound would carry and echo, music and dance and firelight and painted walls, ritual and art and community all woven together. But here's the question that haunts every archaeologist who studies this period. Was there art before? Art that didn't survive? Paint fades, wood rots, leather decays. The earliest art we've found is all in caves or carved from durable materials. But what if they painted on bark, on hide, on their own bodies? What if the creative explosion we see 40,000 years ago wasn't the beginning, but just the point where art finally started being made from materials that could survive? Some researchers think artistic expression goes back much further. Ochre crayons, pieces of pigment apparently used for drawing, appear in South African archaeological sites dating back 100,000 years. Abstract patterns carved into ochre chunks date back 75,000 years. These aren't representational art like the cave paintings, but they're intentional marks, patterns, symbols, the beginning of symbolic thought. Maybe the cave paintings we marvel at today weren't revolutionary at all. Maybe they were just the latest expression of a creative tradition that stretched back 100,000 years or more. A tradition we can only glimpse through the tiny fraction that survived. But what we do see, what remains, tells us something profound about who we were. We weren't just trying to survive, we were trying to live, to create meaning, to transform the world around us into something beautiful and sacred and meaningful, to leave messages for the future, to say, I was here, I mattered, I saw beauty, and I made it real. Those cave painters are our ancestors. Their creative impulse lives in us. Every painting, every song, every story we create today is part of that same unbroken tradition that started in firelit caves 40,000 years ago. The first artists are still speaking to us, still showing us who we are, still reminding us that being human means more than just surviving. It means creating, expressing, connecting across time and space through the universal language of art. And in the quiet darkness of those painted caves, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them, the ancient voices, singing songs we've forgotten, telling stories that echo through millennia, inviting us to remember that we've always been artists, always been dreamers, always been human. Picture the world 20,000 years ago, ice sheets 2 miles thick covering Canada, Scandinavia, most of Britain. Glaciers grinding their way south across what would become New York, Berlin, Moscow. So much water locked up in ice that sea levels dropped 400 feet. Coastlines pushed out for miles, exposing land bridges between continents. The planet was a freezer, and your ancestors were living in it. This was the last glacial maximum, the deepest freeze of the most recent ice age. And somehow, impossibly, humans not only survived it, they thrived. They multiplied. They spread across frozen landscapes that should have killed them. They turned the Ice Age into an opportunity. But here's what most people don't understand about the Ice Age. It wasn't one long freeze. It was a series of climate swings that lasted over 100,000 years, periods of intense cold punctuated by brief warming phases, then plunging back into glaciation. The climate was unstable, unpredictable, capable of shifting dramatically within a single generation. Your ancestors had to adapt to this chaos, and they did it through innovation that would make modern engineers jealous. Start with the most basic problem, staying warm. When temperatures plunge below freezing for months at a time, exposure kills you in hours. Your ancestors couldn't just huddle around fires and hope for the best. They needed technology, so they invented clothing as we know it. Not simple animal skins draped over shoulders, but tailored fitted garments designed to trap heat and block wind. Archaeological evidence shows they were sewing complex outfits 30,000 years ago, maybe earlier. Bone needles, incredibly fine and precisely made, show up in Ice Age sites across Europe and Asia. These weren't crude implements. These were specialized tools that could pierce leather and sinew, creating watertight seams. Think about what this means cognitively. You have to kill an animal, process its hide through days of scraping and curing, cut pieces to specific patterns that match the human body, then stitch them together with cordage made from animal sinews. That's planning, that's abstract thinking, that's engineering. And they didn't stop there. Evidence suggests they were creating layered clothing systems, base layers against the skin, insulating middle layers of fur, weather-resistant outer layers. The same principles modern mountaineers use, invented by Ice Age humans with nothing but stone tools and animal materials. But clothing alone wasn't enough. They needed shelter. In the treeless frozen steppes of Ice Age Europe and Asia, there was no wood for substantial construction, so they improvised. They built houses out of bones, mammoth bone houses, structures using hundreds of bones from multiple animals, arranged in circular patterns with mammoth skulls forming the foundation. Long bones arched overhead to create dome-shaped frames, all covered with hides and sod for insulation. These weren't temporary camps. These were engineered dwellings designed to withstand winter winds and heavy snow loads. One site in Ukraine shows a mammoth bone house that required the bones from at least 95 different mammoths. The construction would have taken weeks, maybe months, and it worked. People lived in these structures for years, maybe generations, successfully weathering winters that would kill an unprotected human in hours. Inside these shelters, they maintained fires using a carefully managed fuel economy. When wood was scarce, they burned bone, which produces intense heat, but requires sophisticated fire management to ignite and maintain. They created stone-lined hearths that maximized heat output and minimized smoke. They developed ventilation systems that let smoke escape while preserving warmth. This is survival engineering at the highest level, but it gets even more impressive when you consider what they were hunting. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant bison, megafauna that could weigh several tons, animals that could kill a human with a single blow. And your ancestors were taking them down regularly enough to build houses from their bones. How do you hunt a mammoth with stone-tipped spears? Very carefully, with very sophisticated tactics. The evidence suggests they used coordinated, group hunting strategies that required complex planning and communication. They identified migration routes and returned to the same locations year after year, places where terrain channeled animal movements into predictable patterns. They used natural features, cliffs, ravines, frozen rivers, to create kill zones where large animals could be trapped or driven. Some sites show evidence of systematic butchering operations that processed thousands of pounds of meat and bone. This wasn't opportunistic scavenging. This was organized hunting, possibly involving dozens of people working in coordinated teams with planned roles. And they wasted nothing. Meat for food, bones for shelter and tools, hides for clothing, sinews for cordage, fat rendered for fuel and waterproofing. A single mammoth could sustain a group for months if properly processed and stored. In the frozen north, Natural refrigeration meant meat could be preserved through long winters, stockpiled against lean times. But even the best hunters faced disasters, climate fluctuations, animal migration pattern changes, disease outbreaks, accidents. During the Ice Age, human populations experienced multiple bottlenecks, periods when total numbers crashed to frighteningly low levels. Genetic analysis shows several of these near-extinction events, times when human populations dropped to a few thousand individuals worldwide. Not as severe as the Great Bottleneck 900,000 years before, but still moments when our species teetered on the edge of oblivion. What saved us was the same metapopulation structure that had preserved our ancestors during earlier crises. Small groups scattered across vast territories, connected by kinship networks and trade relationships, but independent enough that no single disaster could eliminate everyone. When one group failed, others survived. When resources collapsed in one region, people migrated to territories where conditions were better. This flexibility, this ability to move and adapt rather than stay and perish, was perhaps the most important survival strategy of all, and move they did. The Ice Age created opportunities for migration that hadn't existed before. Lowered sea levels exposed land bridges between continents. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America, a 1,000-mile wide corridor of frozen grassland that allowed humans and animals to walk between continents. The Sunda Shelf connected Southeast Asian mainland with Indonesia, creating a vast peninsula where islands now exist. Bass Strait linked Australia and Tasmania. Britain was attached to continental Europe. These land bridges weren't just narrow crossings. They were extensive territories with their own ecosystems and resources, and humans exploited them brilliantly, following animal migrations across continental boundaries, establishing trade networks that stretched thousands of miles, sharing technologies and knowledge across populations that would eventually be separated by rising seas. Coastal routes also became crucial. As ice locked up water, exposed coastlines provided resource-rich corridors for human migration. Shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, all concentrated in coastal zones that humans could exploit with relatively simple technologies. Evidence suggests some populations became specialized coastal dwellers, developing boats and fishing technologies that allowed them to follow coastlines around entire continents. This might explain how humans reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, a journey that would have required crossing significant stretches of open water even when sea levels were low. The Ice Age was shaping human destiny through climate as a constant, relentless force. But it wasn't just making things harder. It was also creating opportunities, opening new territories, concentrating resources in refugia where humans could thrive. In southern Europe, regions like the Franco-Cantabrian zone became Ice Age refugia, where relatively mild climates and abundant resources supported dense human populations. These regions became hotspots of cultural innovation, producing the magnificent cave art we'll explore later, developing sophisticated tool technologies that would spread across the continent. In Africa, shifting rainfall patterns created and destroyed lakes, grasslands, and forests over millennia. Humans tracked these changes, moving with the resources, adapting to new environments as conditions shifted. The Sahara alternated between desert and grassland multiple times, each transition forcing populations to migrate or adapt. Asia's diverse geography created dozens of isolated regions, where populations developed unique survival strategies. High-altitude groups in Tibet and the Himalayas adapted to thin air and extreme cold. Steppe populations followed vast herds across grasslands. Forest dwellers developed technologies for exploiting dense woodland resources. And through it all, the climate kept changing. temperatures fluctuating, ice advancing and retreating, sea levels rising and falling. Your ancestors lived through climate changes more dramatic than anything modern civilization has experienced. Changes that destroyed ecosystems and created new ones, that forced entire populations to move or perish. They survived through intelligence, cooperation, and technological innovation, through social systems that maintained knowledge across generations, through trade networks that shared resources and information, through cultural adaptations that let them thrive in environments that should have been impossible for a tropical ape to inhabit. By the time the Ice Age finally ended 12,000 years ago, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed technologies and survival strategies that would form the foundation for agriculture, civilization, everything that came after. But they were still hunter-gatherers, still living in small groups, still following the ancient patterns that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. The Ice Age had tested them relentlessly, and they had passed every test. What happened next would change everything. The warming climate would create new opportunities and new challenges, and your ancestors, tempered by millennia of survival at the extremes, were ready for whatever came next. Picture a single footprint in wet sand on a beach in what would one day be called Arabia. 60,000 years ago, maybe less, one human foot pressing into coastal mud during low tide. Behind that person, Africa. Ahead, literally the entire rest of the world. Empty. Waiting. That footprint, long since washed away, marked the beginning of the greatest migration in Earth's history. Not the first time humans left Africa, actually. There had been earlier attempts, earlier waves. Homo erectus had made it to Asia nearly 2 million years before. Other archaic humans had ventured into the Levant, established populations, then vanished when the climate shifted. But this time was different. This time, the migrants carried something their predecessors hadn't possessed. The full package of modern human cognition, enhanced by hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection, refined by the genetic bottleneck, sharpened by survival in Africa's unpredictable environments. They weren't planning to conquer the world. They were probably just following game animals along the coast, maybe fleeing drought or conflict back home, perhaps simply curious about what lay beyond the horizon. But what they started would, within just 50,000 years, put human footprints on every continent except Antarctica. In every environment Earth had to offer, from Arctic ice to tropical rainforest, from mountain peaks to remote ocean islands. The speed of this expansion would have seemed impossible to earlier human species. Neanderthals had taken hundreds of thousands of years to spread across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans had expanded through Eastern Asia over similar timescales. But modern humans? We went from a small population confined to Africa to a global species in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink. The first route out was probably coastal, following the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula, then along the coasts of South Asia. This makes sense for a species that had evolved in Africa. Coastal environments offer reliable resources: shellfish, fish, seabirds, sea turtle eggs. You don't need to learn entirely new survival strategies when you're following a coastline. The beach in Yemen looks different from the beach in India, but the basic resource extraction techniques remain similar. But here's what's remarkable. These coastal migrants were moving fast, maybe 5 to 10 kilometers per generation. Doesn't sound like much, right? But compound that over 1,000 generations and you've circumnavigated half the planet. Genetic evidence suggests the descendants of those first migrants reached Australia within about 5,000 years of leaving Africa. Australia. Think about that for a moment. To reach Australia 65,000 years ago required crossing open ocean. not just paddling across a narrow strait, but making multiple sea crossings, some of them over 90 kilometers of open water, out of sight of land, navigating by stars, currents, bird flight patterns, whatever environmental cues they could read. This wasn't accidental. You don't accidentally build boats capable of carrying families and supplies across 90 kilometers of ocean. You don't accidentally navigate to a continent you've never seen. These were planned voyages, deliberate expeditions into the unknown. Some probably ended in disaster, boats swept off course, families lost to storms or currents. But enough succeeded that within a few thousand years, humans had established populations across the Australian continent and even reached New Guinea, which was connected to Australia during the Ice Age. And they didn't just arrive and survive, they thrived. Aboriginal Australians developed sophisticated fire management techniques, essentially terraforming the continent to suit their needs. They created trade networks spanning thousands of kilometres. They developed some of the world's most complex kinship systems. All of this in environments that range from tropical rainforest to burning desert to temperate woodland. Meanwhile, back in Asia, other branches of that initial out-of-Africa migration were pushing north and west. Some groups moved into the Middle East, where they encountered Neanderthals. The genetic evidence shows they didn't just compete with Neanderthals, they interbred with them. Modern humans of European and Asian descent carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA, the legacy of those ancient encounters. Other groups pushed further east into what's now China and Southeast Asia. There they met Denisovans, and again interbreeding occurred. Modern Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Some Tibetan populations have Denisovan genetic variants that help them process oxygen at high altitudes. We literally carry pieces of these extinct human species in our genome, souvenirs from meetings that happened 50,000 years ago. But the most astounding migrations were yet to come. Around 40,000 years ago, humans reached Europe. Not the first humans there. Neanderthals had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, but modern humans brought something new. Within about 5,000 years of arriving in Europe, they had essentially replaced the Neanderthal population. Not through violence necessarily, though conflict certainly occurred. More likely through competitive exclusion. Modern humans could simply extract more resources from the same environments, support larger populations, innovate faster when conditions changed. The Neanderthals, magnificent survivors who had endured ice age after ice age, couldn't compete with populations that could create art, develop complex symbols, maintain larger social networks. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone. Not extinct in the absolute sense, they left genetic contributions in modern humans, but extinct as a separate species, absorbed into the expanding modern human population. Modern humans were also pushing into environments no human species had ever successfully colonized. Into the Arctic reaches of Siberia, where winter temperatures could drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius. The archaeological record shows they were there by 30,000 years ago, developing specialized cold weather technologies, tailored clothing made from multiple animal skins, semi-subterranean houses heated by bone-fueled fires, sophisticated strategies for hunting mammoth and other Ice Age megafauna. These weren't primitive people barely surviving in harsh conditions. They were creating art, burying their dead with elaborate grave goods, manufacturing complex tools from mammoth ivory and bone, living not just surviving in one of Earth's most challenging environments. And then came the really big journey. The peopling of the Americas. The details are still debated by archaeologists. For decades, the consensus was that humans first entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge called Beringia that connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. Walking through an ice-free corridor between massive glaciers, then spreading rapidly down through North and South America. But recent discoveries have complicated this neat story. Archaeological sites in both North and South America are pushing the dates back. Maybe 15,000 years ago, maybe 20,000. Some controversial sites suggest even earlier dates, though these remain hotly debated, and the route is being reconsidered. Maybe instead of walking through an ice corridor, the first Americans travelled by boat along the Pacific coast, island hopping down from Alaska to Chile. What's certain is that once humans reached the Americas, they spread with astounding speed. By 14,000 years ago, they had reached the southern tip of South America. That's roughly 15,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait, in maybe 5,000 years or less. Along the way, they adapted to every environment the Americas offered. Arctic tundra, temperate forests, Great Plains grasslands, Amazonian rainforest, Andean highlands, Patagonian steppes. Each environment required new strategies, new technologies, new knowledge, how to hunt bison on the plains, how to grow manioc in tropical forests, how to extract resources from the ocean along thousands of kilometers of coastline. And they figured it all out, fast enough that within a few thousand years, complex societies were emerging across both continents. But perhaps the most impressive maritime achievements were still to come. Around 3,500 years ago, humans began colonizing the remote Pacific islands. Not the near islands. Those had been reached tens of thousands of years earlier, but the really remote ones, Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. These weren't accidental discoveries. You don't accidentally sail 4,000 kilometers to Hawaii. These were deliberate voyages of exploration and colonization. Polynesians developed sophisticated double-hulled canoes capable of carrying families, livestock and plants across vast ocean distances. They navigated using stars, wave patterns, bird behavior, and detailed knowledge passed down through generations. They could look at clouds on the horizon and determine whether land lay beneath them, read swells to detect islands beyond the visual range. By 1,000 years ago, humans had reached essentially every habitable place on Earth. We had gone from a small population in Africa to a global species present on every continent and thousands of remote islands. No other large mammal has ever achieved anything comparable, and we can track this expansion in unprecedented detail. DNA has become a time machine, allowing us to map ancient migrations with remarkable precision. When populations split, they start accumulating different genetic mutations. The longer they're separated, the more differences accumulate. By comparing modern genomes, geneticists can reconstruct ancient migration routes, estimate when populations diverged, even identify interbreeding events with other human species. The genetic map reveals details no archaeological site could tell us. There were back migrations, populations that left Africa then returned. There were lost populations that left genetic traces but no archaeological record. There were multiple waves of migration into the same regions, earlier populations replaced or absorbed by later arrivals. We're discovering that human prehistory was far more complex than we imagined. Not a simple tree with populations branching off and never meeting again, but a braided stream with populations splitting, merging, exchanging genes and ideas across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. Some of these populations left only genetic ghosts, DNA sequences that don't match any known fossil humans, possible evidence of human species we haven't discovered yet, known only through their genetic contributions to living people. The history is still being written, new discoveries constantly revising our understanding. But one thing is clear. The humans who left Africa 60,000 years ago carried something that allowed them to succeed where earlier humans had failed. Some combination of cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and technological innovation that made them essentially unstoppable. Once they started moving, nothing could contain them. Not oceans, not ice sheets, not deserts, not mountain ranges. Within 50,000 years, human fires were burning on every continent. Human voices speaking hundreds of different languages were echoing across every landscape Earth offered. The age of global humanity had begun, but they weren't done adapting, not even close. Here's something that will change how you think about everything. 100,000 years ago, someone took flowers to a grave. Not just any flowers, carefully selected blooms, arranged deliberately around the body of someone they loved. We know this because archaeologists found the pollen, preserved in the soil of a cave in northern Iraq, unmistakable evidence that Neanderthals, our extinct cousins, were doing something no other animal had ever done. They were trying to make death beautiful. Think about what that means. Not just that they grieved, lots of animals grieve. Not just that they buried their dead, that's impressive enough. But that they wanted the grave to be special. That they thought placing flowers there would somehow matter. This wasn't survival. This wasn't adaptation or natural selection. This was something else entirely. This was the birth of spirituality. And it happened tens of thousands of years before the first churches, the first temples, the first priests or prophets or holy books. Before anyone had written down a single prayer or commandment or creation myth, our ancestors were already grappling with the biggest questions of existence. What happens when we die? Does consciousness continue? Is there meaning beyond survival and reproduction? They didn't have answers, but they had flowers. The oldest deliberate human burial we've found dates back about 130,000 years. A cave in Israel, 2 bodies laid out with care. Not just tossed in a pit or left where they fell, but positioned intentionally, hands arranged, bodies oriented in a specific direction. Why? What were they thinking as they placed those bodies? Were they worried about the journey ahead for the deceased, trying to help them find their way to some imagined afterlife? Or were they just trying to hold on to their loved ones for a few more hours before the earth took them forever? We'll never know for certain. But we can make some educated guesses based on what hunter-gatherers believed in more recent times, and based on the archaeological evidence that keeps accumulating from sites across the world. And what that evidence suggests is absolutely fascinating. Red ochre. It shows up in graves everywhere. This iron-rich mineral that produces brilliant red pigment, sprinkled over bodies, rubbed into skin before burial, sometimes packed around the deceased in quantities that must have required tremendous effort to gather and process. It appears in Neanderthal graves. It appears in early modern human burials. It shows up in sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. This wasn't random. This was ritual. But what did it mean? Some anthropologists think red ochre symbolized blood, life force, the vital energy that animated living beings. By covering the dead in red, maybe they were trying to maintain that connection, to keep the life force present even after the body had stopped functioning. Others think it represented rebirth. The red of sunrise, the promise that death wasn't the end but a transformation into something else. We don't know, but we know it mattered desperately to them. Then there are the grave goods, tools buried with the dead, weapons, carefully crafted points and blades placed within reach of hands that would never move again, food offerings, animal bones showing cut marks, evidence that meat had been prepared and left for the deceased, jewellery, shells and carved stones and animal teeth strung on cords, decorations that took hours to make, buried where no living eyes would see them. This tells us something crucial. They believed the dead were going somewhere, that they would need things, that the journey didn't end with the last breath. But burial practices are just the surface layer. Beneath them lies something far stranger and more profound, a worldview so alien to modern thinking that most of us can barely wrap our minds around it. Our ancestors, for hundreds of thousands of years, lived in a world that was completely, utterly alive. Everything had a spirit, not metaphorically, not as some poetic way of appreciating nature, but as literal, living consciousness inhabiting every aspect of the world around them. The rock wasn't just a rock. It was a being, with its own awareness, its own intentions, its own power. The river wasn't just water flowing downhill. It was an entity that could be pleased or angered, that remembered and responded, that had relationships with the humans who depended on it. Animals weren't just meat on legs. They were people, different people, wearing different forms, but people nonetheless. With languages of their own, societies of their own, knowledge and wisdom that humans could only access through proper respect and negotiation. This worldview, which anthropologists call animism, wasn't superstition or primitive confusion. It was a sophisticated philosophical framework that explained their entire reality. When you live as a hunter-gatherer, completely dependent on the natural world for every calorie of energy, every material for tools and shelter, every medicine that keeps your children alive, you develop an intimate relationship with that world. You notice patterns. You see how everything connects, how the behavior of birds can predict weather changes, how certain plants always grow near certain stones, how animal migrations follow rhythms that sync with star movements. You're not separate from nature, observing it from outside. You're embedded in it, one participant among many in an endlessly complex web of relationships. In that context, animism makes perfect sense. If everything is connected, if everything responds to everything else, then everything must be aware at some level. The rock that makes the best tools must want to be found by the skilled craftsperson. The deer that walks into your hunting ground must have chosen to give itself to you. The storm that devastates your camp must be angry about something your people did. The world becomes a constant negotiation, a never-ending conversation between human consciousness and the thousands of other consciousnesses sharing the same landscape. And if everything has a spirit, then some humans must be better at communicating with those spirits than others. Enter the shamans. Evidence for shamanic practices goes back at least 40,000 years, probably much further. Cave paintings showing figures that are part human, part animal. Theranthropes, anthropologists call them. Human bodies with antlers or bird heads or lion faces, beings that exist between categories, that can cross boundaries normal humans can't. These weren't just artistic imagination. These were representations of shamanic practitioners who had learned to transform themselves, to leave their human consciousness behind and enter the awareness of other beings. How did they do it? Part of it was intense training, techniques passed down through generations for entering trance states, rhythmic drumming that could last for hours, dancing until exhaustion shut down normal consciousness, sensory deprivation in dark caves, exposure to extremes of heat or cold, fasting for days until hunger began producing hallucinations. But there was another tool too, one that appears in the archaeological and ethnographic record again and again. Plant medicines. Hunter-gatherers knew their landscapes intimately. They knew which plants healed wounds and which plants killed, which berries provided calories and which berries produced visions. We have evidence that ancient humans were using psychoactive plants for tens of thousands of years. Ergot fungus on stored grains, psilocybin mushrooms from cow dung, datura and henbane and dozens of other consciousness-altering plants that grew in specific locations, harvested at specific times, prepared according to careful protocols. These weren't recreational drugs. These were technologies for accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness, for experiencing the spirit world directly. And what did they find there? Based on modern studies of hunter-gatherer shamanism and on the imagery left behind in cave paintings and rock art, they found a reality more vast and strange than the ordinary world. They encountered spirit beings, entities that shared knowledge, that showed them where to find game animals or medicinal plants. They experienced death and rebirth, their own consciousness dissolving and reforming in new configurations. They travelled to other realms, upper worlds of sky spirits and lower worlds of earth powers, returning with songs and stories and instructions for their people. Were these experiences real? That's the wrong question. They were real to the people having them, real enough to shape their societies, to guide their decisions, to give meaning to their existence in a harsh and often terrifying world. And then, 11,600 years ago, someone built something that shouldn't exist. Göbekli Tepe, on a hilltop in what's now Turkey. Massive stone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circular enclosures that took decades to construct. The oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, older than the pyramids by 7,000 years, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Here's the thing that breaks every model we had for human development. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, not farmers, not settled villagers with surplus grain and specialized labor. Nomadic people who still got their food from wild plants and animals. And yet they organized themselves to quarry, transport and erect stones that required hundreds or thousands of person-hours of labor. They created art that shows sophisticated symbolic thinking. They maintained the site for centuries, holding gatherings and ceremonies that must have drawn people from hundreds of miles around. Why? What could possibly motivate hunter-gatherers to invest that much time and energy into something that didn't help them survive? The only answer that makes sense is religion. Belief so powerful it overrode every practical consideration. They built Göbekli Tepe because the spirits demanded it. Because the rituals performed there were more important than food or shelter or safety. Because whatever happened at that hilltop temple, under stars that haven't changed position in 12,000 years, mattered more than anything else in their world. And they were watching those stars. We know this from sites across the globe, stone circles aligned to solstice sunrises, cave paintings positioned to catch light on specific days, megalithic structures that track lunar cycles with precision that rivals modern astronomy. These weren't just pretty arrangements. These were sophisticated instruments for measuring time, for predicting seasonal changes, for connecting human ritual with cosmic rhythms. They knew when Mars went retrograde. They tracked Venus through its 584-day cycle. They understood that the summer solstice sun rose at a different point on the horizon than the winter solstice sun, and they encoded this knowledge in stone, preserving it for generations who would continue the observations, refining the measurements, maintaining the sacred connection between earth and sky. Why did they care so much about celestial mechanics? Because the sky was where the spirits lived. Because the movements of stars and planets told stories about the gods, about creation, about the proper order of things. Because aligning your ceremonies with cosmic cycles gave them power, brought you into harmony with forces vastly greater than human consciousness. They were doing astronomy, yes, but they were also doing theology. The tragedy is that we'll never fully understand what they believed. They left no written records, no sacred texts, no theological treatises explaining their cosmology. All we have are hints, burials and ochre and stone circles and cave paintings, fragments of a belief system that sustained human communities for hundreds of thousands of years, that gave meaning to birth and death and the endless struggle to survive. that connected individual human consciousness to something transcendent and eternal. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the mystery is the point. Our ancestors lived with uncertainty in a way we've forgotten how to do. They didn't have answers. They had questions and rituals and the profound humility that comes from knowing you're a tiny spark of awareness in an incomprehensibly vast universe. They had flowers for graves. They had red ochre and stone circles and shamanic journeys to worlds beyond imagining. They had each other, gathered around fires, telling stories about the spirits, trying to make sense of it all. And sometimes, late at night, when the rational mind quiets down and you're staring up at stars that humans have been watching for 300,000 years, you can almost feel what they felt. That sense of connection, that awareness of mystery, that recognition that consciousness is stranger and more wonderful than any explanation could capture. They believed in a living world. Maybe in our deepest moments so do we. Now, imagine lying back beside one of those Ice Age campfires. The stars are brutally bright. The night is cold enough to bite your lungs. Around you, a small band of humans is doing something that, at first glance, looks almost laughably simple. They're hitting rocks together. It doesn't look like technology. It doesn't look like genius. It just looks like banging stones. But if you slow the moment down, if you watch every movement in slow motion, the illusion falls apart. That flake of flint that just flew off, its thickness, its angle, even the way it curves, all of that was predicted, planned, controlled. The napper knows exactly where to strike. Not a random blow, but a precise hit at just the right angle, with just the right force, using a hammerstone of just the right hardness. They've learned to read the stone the way you read a book. Grain, fracture lines, hidden flaws. One wrong strike and the whole piece is ruined. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, some people were already good enough to make the same shape over and over again. Standardized spear points, scrapers, blades as thin as your fingernail, sharp enough to slice meat, tendons, skin. Anthropologists who try to copy these techniques today often train for years and still can't match the skill of so-called primitive flint nappers. Some of those Ice Age hunters could turn raw rock into a perfectly balanced spear, tip in minutes, by firelight, in freezing winds. And that skill wasn't just individual talent, it was culture, a whole body of technical knowledge, which rocks to choose, how to heat them, how to repair damaged tools instead of starting from scratch. Hidden in those flint chips is a quiet miracle. Human minds capable of long chains of reasoning, cause and effect, geometry and planning, all wrapped in a deceptively simple movement of hand and stone. Now shift the scene. You're standing at the edge of an ancient shoreline. The waves are rough. The horizon is a hard, dark line, and somewhere beyond it there's land you can't see. Yet your ancestors got there. We know they did, because we find their bones and tools on islands that were never connected to the mainland, even at the lower sea levels. People reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago. They reached islands in Indonesia, the Mediterranean, the Western Pacific. That means they crossed open water, no compasses, no maps, no metal, just wood, fibre, skin, and knowledge. Picture a small group of humans pushing a boat into the surf. Maybe it's a bundle of logs lashed tight with plant fibres. Maybe it's a dugout canoe hollowed by fire and stone tools. Maybe it's something we haven't even imagined correctly, because the sea took the wood thousands of years ago and left us only silence. They watch the waves for days, maybe weeks, learning the rhythm. They study the way birds fly at dawn and dusk. They taste the wind, feel the currents, memorize the stars. Because navigation, at its core, is pattern recognition, and that our ancestors were very, very good at. Some indigenous navigators in the Pacific, even in recent centuries, could sail hundreds of miles using nothing but stars, swells, and the flight paths of birds. That same kind of mental map would have guided those first voyages tens of thousands of years earlier. Invisible pathways written in the shape of the waves and the positions of the constellations. To step into a boat when you can't see the land you're headed toward. That's not just technology. That's faith in your knowledge. Trust in patterns that have been observed, debated, remembered, and passed down for generations. And speaking of knowledge passed down, travel with your imagination into a dense ancient forest. The air is wet and heavy. Every plant is a stranger. Some can feed you. Some can heal you. Some can kill you slowly and painfully. Our ancestors walked into that living pharmacy with no written labels, no textbooks, no scientific journals, and somehow they figured it out. Bark for fevers, leaves for wounds, roots for stomach pain, smokes for parasites, poultices, teas, chews, smudges, juices concentrated in little bundles of fibre. Modern pharmacology estimates that a huge proportion of our medicines ultimately trace back to traditional plant use. Aspirin from tree bark, powerful cancer drugs from obscure vines, painkillers from sap and seeds. Now ask yourself, how many discoveries were made and forgotten long before any of that knowledge ever touched paper? Trial and error sounds simple until you realize what it means. Someone experimented on themselves. Someone misjudged the dose and got sick. Someone changed the preparation method and discovered that boiling removes toxins, or that mixing two plants cancels out side effects. Over tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer societies built immense, detailed pharmacopoeias, lists of which plants to use, how to prepare them, which symptoms they treat, which plants you must never combine. That knowledge had to be memorized, tested, argued about, refined. In some cultures today, a single elder healer may know hundreds, even thousands of plant species by sight, smell, taste, and effect. That's with cultures already damaged by colonization and loss. Imagine the depth of knowledge in a world where the forest was your only pharmacy. For 100,000 years. Now step out of the forest and stand beside a stone that has been waiting for you for 5,000 winters. You look up and up and up. Megaliths, massive stones weighing tens, even hundreds of tons. Sarsens at Stonehenge, trilithons at Baalbek, great blocks in prehistoric tombs scattered across Europe, Asia, Africa, all built with no steel, no cranes, no diesel engines. We tend to imagine these as late wonders, but the mental toolkit that built them is much older. It's the same toolkit that let small Ice Age bands move huge animal carcasses back to camp. The same ability to coordinate dozens of people in a single complicated task, to plan weeks or months ahead, to test different methods and refine them. Levers, rollers, sledges, ramps, wet clay, frozen ground, animal power, human power. Even if we don't know the exact tricks they used at every site, we know something more fundamental. Somebody knew. Entire communities understood how to shape, move, and fit stone so precisely that joints are still tight after thousands of freeze-thaw cycles. They knew how to align those stones with solstices and equinoxes, with star risings and lunar standstills, using nothing but eyes, stakes, and shadows. None of that comes from a single stroke of genius. It comes from cumulative experimentation, generations of craftspeople learning from their elders, adding tiny improvements, preserving techniques like a living code. But how do you preserve complex knowledge when there's nothing to write on? You tell stories. Around those Ice Age campfires, people weren't just talking about the day's hunt. They were maintaining an entire library in their heads. Oral traditions can be astonishingly precise. In Australia, some Aboriginal stories remember coastlines that were flooded by rising seas over 7,000 years ago. Polynesian songs encode navigation routes as sequences of stars, winds, and swells. Myths that sound like fantasy may hide detailed instructions: where to fish, when to plant, which animal migrations to follow, which valleys to avoid when the river runs brown. Think about what that means for memory. A child hears a story not once, but hundreds of times. They hear it sung, acted, whispered, argued over. Tiny differences are corrected by elders. Exaggerations might get laughed at, but the core facts are guarded carefully. Sacred. Embedded in myths about gods and monsters may be maps of safe harbours, lists of medicinal plants, warnings about rare disasters. Don't build here. Once, long ago, the sea climbed the cliffs. Don't eat that fish. It will make your hands twist. When that star burns bright above the hills, the rains will fail. In a world without writing, forgetting isn't just embarrassing, it's deadly. So stories become mnemonic devices, rhythms, rhymes, dramatic images that hook into the brain's pattern-loving circuits. Entire cosmologies arise around practical knowledge, because wrapping information in meaning makes it unforgettable. And yet, not everything survived. Some technologies left traces: stone, bone, burnt shell. But many were made of wood, fibre, leather, plant matter, materials that rot, sink and vanish. How many forms of boat building disappeared when a particular coastal culture died out? How many weaving techniques, knot systems, musical instruments? How many ways of preserving food, fermenting drinks, tanning hides, smoking fish, storing grain, disappeared with the last elder who remembered exactly how long, exactly how hot, exactly how much? Even more haunting, how many ideas did humans try that never quite caught on? Experiments in planting seeds deliberately that stayed local rumours instead of spreading. Early attempts at animal taming that didn't become full domestication. Simple machines, counting systems, even proto-writing scratched on bark or knotted into ropes that left no trace we can see. When archaeologists find a single enigmatic artifact, a carved bone with unexplained marks, a sophisticated tool type that appears and vanishes, you're catching a glimpse of a much larger iceberg. A whole cloud of experiments, successes and failures, living technologies and fragile traditions, most of which melted away without a fossil. We tend to imagine a straight line, primitive to advanced, ignorance to knowledge. But the real story is messier, branching, tangled, full of cul-de-sacs and lost branches. In that tangle, some of the greatest geniuses who ever lived might have been anonymous hunter-gatherers. The person who first realized that heating certain stones made better tools. The woman who discovered that pounding a bitter seed, soaking it and roasting it turned poison into food. The navigator who connected the seasonal appearance of a star with a safe current that led to a distant island. No monuments bear their names, no books record their thoughts. But you're living inside the consequences of their insights. And this is where the word primitive begins to fall apart. To survive as a small band on a harsh, unpredictable planet requires a kind of intelligence that most of us, sitting in climate-controlled rooms, never need to develop. It means knowing 50 different animal tracks by sight, reading weather from the smell of the air, recalling from memory the exact location of a spring you last visited 3 years ago, hidden in a fold of hills 2 days' walk from here. It means holding in your head a mental map of hundreds of square miles, layered with information, food sources, dangers, stories, sacred places, trails, seasonal camps. It means coordinating hunts, sharing food fairly enough that the group doesn't explode into conflict, and still raising children with songs and stories. These weren't half-formed minds waiting for civilization to wake them up. They were fully human, curious, observant, inventive, geniuses of their environments. When we look back on the missing 100,000 years before civilization, the long night before cities, before writing, before bronze and iron, we're not looking at a blank. We're looking at a vast, intricate tapestry of skills and insights, most of which left only the faintest traces. Every stone tool, every healed bone, every fragment of ancient DNA is a clue. But for every technology we can reconstruct, there are probably dozens we can only guess at, and hundreds we'll never know existed. Somewhere out there, beneath the ocean, under layers of silt and sand, lie the drowned camps of coastal peoples who knew the tides like we know the hours on a clock. Deep in soils and caves lie the dust of plants once used as medicines, so effective we'd call them miracles. In the unrecorded recesses of time, whole schools of thought, whole traditions of craftsmanship, flared briefly and vanished. And yet, not everything was lost. Some of that ancient knowledge trickled forward, embedded in the DNA you carry, in the cultural instincts for cooperation, storytelling, pattern-seeking. Some survived more directly, in indigenous traditions that still honor stars, plants, stones, and stories as living teachers. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine your own mind as part of that long chain. The curiosity that keeps you listening, even now, in the dark, that's the same curiosity that once watched a spark leap from a fire and wondered, what else can we burn? The same curiosity that tasted a strange berry, studied a strange star, shaped a strange stone. The technologies may change, the tools may shine brighter, hum louder. But the mind behind them, restlessly asking, testing, remembering, imagining, that mind is very old, forged in those missing 100,000 years, and it was just about to do something it had never done before. Now drift forward with me. You've watched your ancestors walk out of Africa. You've seen them endure ice ages, cross seas, paint caves by firelight, and tell stories under skies full of unfamiliar stars. For hundreds of thousands of years, through all of that, one thing stayed the same. They did not farm. They hunted. They gathered. They moved with the seasons. They followed the migrations of animals, the ripening of plants, the slow turning of the planet itself. And then, almost like a plot twist that arrives very late in the story, something changed. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in a few small corners of the world, quietly, gently, almost invisibly at first. People started to do something new. They began to plant. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. Neolithic just means New Stone Age. But the change it describes is bigger than stone. It's the moment when humans stopped relying entirely on wild plants and animals and began to reshape the living world to feed themselves. It began roughly 12,000 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age. The great ice sheets retreated, forests crept north, rain patterns shifted. Places that had been cold and dry became warmer, wetter, more predictable. In a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching from modern Israel and Palestine up through Syria, Turkey and into Iraq, wild grains like wheat and barley grew thickly on the hillsides. Gazelles and wild sheep wandered the plains. Fig trees and lentils, peas and flax all rooted themselves in this new, gentler climate. Your ancestors were already there. They had been there for thousands of years, living in small bands, following the cycles of migration and harvest, using stone tools and fire in ways that had been refined across continents and ages. At first, nothing looked different. They still gathered wild seeds. They still hunted. They still roasted meat over embers and ground grain on stone. But slowly, quietly, someone noticed something. If you scattered a few drop seeds near your campsite, the plants came back. If you stayed in one place just a little longer, You could tend the ground, clear the rocks, pull the weeds. If you kept the animals close instead of chasing them, they got used to you. No single person invented farming, just as no one person invented language or fire. It was a slow accumulation of tiny insights. A woman choosing the fattest seeds to plant near a spring. A child bringing home a young lamb instead of a carcass. A family deciding not to move camp this year because the grain grew so well last year right here. Generation by generation, those tiny choices added up. Wild wheat slowly turned into domesticated wheat. Seeds that stayed attached to the stalks instead of shattering in the wind were easier to harvest, so people selected them without even realizing it. Wild sheep and goats turned into animals that were smaller, more docile, more tolerant of human presence. By the time anyone would have thought to name the change, it was already too late. They were farmers. Now you might expect this to be the happiest chapter of the story. More food, more stability, more people, the beginning of villages, towns, cities, civilization. But it's not that simple. Historians and archaeologists still argue about whether agriculture was a blessing or a curse. For your hunter-gatherer ancestors, life was hard, but it was varied. Their diet came from dozens, sometimes hundreds of plants and animals, meat, tubers, nuts, berries, seeds, shellfish, roots, fruits. They walked miles every day, used their whole bodies, knew every bend of the river and every season of every plant. Then came the fields. Now, instead of wandering through diverse landscapes, many people spent long days doing one thing: bending, weeding, planting, reaping. The diet narrowed to a few main crops: wheat and barley here, rice in East Asia, maize in the Americas, sorghum and millet in parts of Africa. Archaeologists can see the cost written directly on ancient bones. Skeletons from early farming villages often show more signs of malnutrition than the hunter-gatherers who lived just before them. Shorter average height, more tooth decay from starchy diets, spine damage from carrying heavy loads and bending over fields, evidence of anemia, infections, and childhood stress. So why did they do it? Because farming did something that hunting and gathering rarely could. It created surplus. A good harvest could feed more people than a few lucky hunts. Stored grain in clay bins could carry families through winter, drought, or a failed season. Even if the diet was poorer, even if daily work was harder, farming could support more children per family. And evolution has a favourite question. What leads to more surviving babies? Farming did. So populations grew, villages swelled. A way of life that might have been worse for any one individual was better for the success of genes over many generations. Imagine one of the earliest farming communities, a cluster of houses near a spring-fed oasis. Archaeologists call one of these places Jericho. It sits in the Jordan Valley, in the modern West Bank, and it is one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements on Earth. 9,000 years ago, Jericho was already more than a camp. Mud brick houses huddled together, some with plastered floors. People cultivated wheat and barley, tended date palms, and probably kept sheep and goats. They dug a massive stone wall around their town, and near it they built a mysterious stone tower, taller than any building their ancestors had ever seen. No one knows exactly why they made it. Defense? Ritual? A community project to bind everyone together? Whatever its purpose, it marks something new in the human story. This was no longer a band of 30 people following herds. This was a permanent settlement, a place that said, "We live here. This is ours." A bit to the northwest, in what is now central Turkey, another strange experiment in living took shape. We know it as Çatalhöyük. 8,000 years ago, it was a dense town of mud brick houses pressed so closely together there were no streets. People walked across flat rooftops and climbed down into their homes by ladders, through holes in the ceiling. Inside, the walls were painted with animals and strange abstract forms. Bull skulls and horns were built into the plaster. Burials were made under house floors so that the dead literally rested beneath the living. The people of Çatalhöyük farmed wheat and barley. They herded sheep and goats. They crafted obsidian blades from black volcanic glass and traded them across long distances. Here, in this maze of rooftops and rooms, you can see it all beginning. Permanent houses, shared projects, art that decorates daily life, crops in fields, animals in pens, trade routes reaching beyond the horizon. But farming brought something else with it. Surplus food meant that not everyone had to grow it. Once you can grow more grain than your own family needs, someone can afford not to farm at all. They can spend their time doing something else. Some became full-time toolmakers, potters or weavers. Some became priests, healers, or specialists in ritual. Some organized irrigation, storage, and the distribution of grain. And slowly, over centuries, differences emerged. Some people controlled more land. Some families had more stored grain, more cattle, more tools. Some individuals started to make decisions for everyone else. Hierarchy was born. What begins as a practical need, someone keeping track of who owes what grain, or who repairs the canal, can turn into power. Power becomes status. Status becomes inherited. The first kings didn't appear in a day. They rose out of a long drift toward inequality made possible by surplus. In the earliest true cities, places like Uruk in Mesopotamia, or later dynasties in Egypt, you see the pattern fully formed. Fields stretching to the horizon, granaries full of stored crops, temples at the centre, overseen by priestly elites, palaces housing rulers whose names are preserved in myths and monuments. But there is another invention, quiet and deceptively simple, that marks the official crossing of a threshold in human history: writing. For hundreds of thousands of years your ancestors lived without it. Every story, every rule, every memory had to be carried in living minds, spoken and resung. Then, in the great river valleys where farming societies grew largest and most complex, marks began to appear. At first they were simple tally marks on bones, shells, or clay, a way to count sheep, jars of grain, days. In Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, people began pressing wedge-shaped signs into wet clay with a reed stylus. We call it cuneiform. These marks stood for numbers, then goods, then names, then ideas. Receipts and ration lists slowly transformed into myths, hymns, laws, and letters. In Egypt, pictures of animals and objects became hieroglyphs. In the Indus Valley, mysterious symbols we still can't fully read appeared on seals. In China, oracle bones were scratched with characters asking questions of the future. With writing, something profound happens. Prehistory ends. History begins. Not because people suddenly became more interesting, but because their voices could finally survive the bodies that spoke them. We can read the complaints of a Sumerian student grumbling about school, the boasts of a king listing the cities he conquered, the recipe for beer on a clay tablet older than most civilizations. But as you listen to this, relaxed in the dark, remember what was gained and what was lost. Civilization brought monumental art, cities that glittered at sunrise, laws that could protect the weak as well as empower the strong. It nurtured philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, written literature, great temples and libraries. It allowed huge numbers of humans to coordinate, cooperate, and sometimes even dream together. It also brought crowded streets full of waste and disease, standing armies, organized warfare on a scale your hunter-gatherer ancestors could not have imagined. slavery, taxes, grinding peasant labour from dawn to dusk in fields they did not own. The same surplus that fed full-time poets and astronomers also fed bureaucrats and warlords. The same walls that sheltered families also penned in those who had no choice. And through it all, something else remained. Something older than civilization, older than farming, older than language as we know it. Choice. Because not everyone said yes to the plough. Long after the rise of Jericho and Çatalhöyük, long after the first cities rose in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, most humans on Earth were still hunters, gatherers, or mixed foragers who farmed a little and roamed a lot. Some groups saw the new farming villages and walked the other way. On the fringes of the fields, in forests, deserts, and highlands, there were people who chose to keep moving, to keep living in smaller groups, to keep following the old ways. Some traded with farmers, exchanging meat, hides, and wild goods for grain and tools. Some raided them, some ignored them entirely. They weren't left behind. They were making different trade-offs, less hierarchy, more mobility, less surplus, more leisure, no palaces, no kings, but knowledge of landscapes that no city dweller could navigate alone. Even today, a few remaining forager and pastoralist societies carry echoes of these choices. They show us that civilization, cities and states are not the only ways humans can organize themselves. They were an experiment, powerful, world-changing, but not inevitable. So as you lie here listening, halfway between waking and dreams, hold this long arc of time in your mind. For most of our existence, we were small bands under big skies. Only in the last thin slice of our story did we build walls, fields, temples, and towers. The dawn of civilization was not a single sunrise, but a slow, uneven brightening, carried by seeds pressed into earth and marks pressed into clay. It brought wonders and horrors, comfort and constraint, beauty and brutality, all tangled together. We are its heirs. Farmers and foragers live inside us both, and the people who first planted those seeds, who first stayed in one place and called it home, could not have imagined the world that would grow from their choice, cities of glass, satellites above the clouds, and you, now, listening in the dark, tracing their footsteps back through time. In the next breaths we'll leave the first cities behind and step back even further, into the quiet before all of this began, to remember what it meant to be human when the only walls were cliffs and the only ceiling was the night. So why does any of this matter to you, lying in bed, listening to stories about people who died tens of thousands of years before the pyramids were even a rumour? Because this isn't just their story, it's your story. When you wake up tomorrow morning, you'll walk through a world of concrete, glass and glowing screens. But the brain doing the walking is not a modern brain. It's a Stone Age brain, a bottleneck brain, a brain sculpted by hundreds of thousands of years of scarcity, danger and tight-knit community, dropped, almost overnight, into a world of supermarkets, skyscrapers and social media. Understanding that deep past is like finally finding the instruction manual for a machine you've been using your whole life, without really knowing how it works. It explains why you feel the way you do, why some things calm you, why other things exhaust you, even when they seem harmless. Think of all those generations you've just travelled through. Tiny bands of humans watching the sky, tracking the seasons, noticing the slightest change in wind or animal behaviour because their lives depended on it. Their nervous systems were tuned for a very specific kind of world. Small groups, open landscapes, slow changes, clear threats. You inherited that nervous system. But it now has to survive in a reality our ancestors could never have imagined. Endless noise, constant alerts, faces on screens instead of faces around fires. Your Stone Age brain is doing its best to interpret all this using tools that evolved to decide very quickly questions like, is that rustle in the grass a predator? Or is that person in my group angry with me? This mismatch between ancient wiring and modern environment is what scientists call the mismatch hypothesis. Our bodies and minds are adapted to one kind of world, but we're living in another. In the bottleneck, anxiety kept your ancestors alive. If you were a little more jumpy, a little more cautious, you were more likely to notice danger early. But now that same cautiousness has to navigate traffic jams, email inboxes, and online arguments. Your brain reacts to a bad comment or a missed deadline with the same stress systems it once used for leopards and blizzards. Knowing this doesn't magically solve anything, but it changes the story. Instead of thinking, what's wrong with me? You can think, my brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do in a world it wasn't built for. That shift brings a kind of quiet compassion, a gentler way of being with yourself, and it goes deeper than stress. For almost all of human history, nobody was alone for very long. Sleeping alone in a room the size of a Paleolithic hut behind a locked door is historically bizarre. Your ancestors slept shoulder to shoulder, listening to each other breathe, hearing the fire crackle and the night animals call. Babies were passed from arm to arm. Elders told stories to the whole group at once. Isolation meant danger. Exile meant almost certain death. That ancient logic still lives inside you. Loneliness hurts not because you're weak, but because for millions of years, being alone was a life-threatening emergency. So when you feel that ache of disconnection in a crowded city, or scroll for hours trying to feel close to someone on a screen, you're not defective. You're a hunter-gatherer nervous system trying to find its band again. Our deep past also shows us something we often forget in modern life. Humans can live for astonishingly long periods of time without destroying the world that sustains them. For tens of thousands of years, those small bands of foragers managed landscapes instead of exhausting them. They burned carefully to renew grasslands. They moved with the seasons to give plants and animals time to recover. They learned the habits, migrations, and reproduction patterns of other species with an intimacy we now reserve for celebrity gossip. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. They overhunted in some places, burned too hot in others. But over the long run, the basic pattern was balance. Take, give, move on, return. It wasn't a moral philosophy. It was survival mathematics learned over uncounted generations. If you overused a place, the place would punish your grandchildren. That knowledge is still alive. You can see it in indigenous fire practices in Australia that prevent the megafires modern systems struggle to control, in Arctic hunting rules that limit when and how animals can be taken so herds remain healthy, in Amazonian agroforests that look like wild jungle but are actually carefully tended food systems thousands of years old. These are not primitive leftovers. They're the most successful long-term survival strategies our species has ever developed. In a world now facing another self-inflicted climate crisis, remembering that history is like remembering that somewhere locked away in our cultural attic we still have the tools we need. We're not newcomers to the problem of living within limits. We're veterans who have forgotten our own training. Understanding the deep past also brings a different kind of humility. Written history, everything we usually learn in school, is a sliver. 5% maybe less of the full human story. Kings, empires, wars, inventions. All of that plays out on a timeline that begins long after your ancestors were painting caves, crossing seas, telling stories to the constellations. For 95% of our existence, there were no chronicles, no written laws, no monuments carved in stone, just memory, voice, gesture, and the shared understanding inside a group that knew each other's faces from birth to death. When you realize that, it shrinks the ego of our so-called modern age. We're not the pinnacle. We're a strange, experimental offshoot that has yet to prove it can last. Those unnamed people, with no history books and no writing, kept the flame of our species alive through ice ages, mega droughts, volcanic winters, and near extinction. They carried language in their throats, maps in their minds, and encyclopedias in their stories. You, with your phone and your electricity and your late-night streaming, are the newest chapter in a book that is almost entirely unwritten. Indigenous peoples today are the pages where those earlier chapters are still barely visible, living bridges between now and then. Their languages, ceremonies, and ecological knowledge aren't just cultures in the modern political sense. They're active archives of experiments in how to be human that go back far beyond written records. When elders describe who may marry whom, or how to share meat from a successful hunt, or which plant can heal a wound and which can quietly kill, they're echoing social systems that were already old when mammoths still walked the earth. Each time a language dies or a land is stripped of the people who know it intimately, the bridge to that ancient knowledge collapses a little more. Another path back to understanding our own species is lost. Taking this history seriously means understanding that these communities are not relics, not frozen in time. They are as dynamic, adaptable, and clever as any other humans, and their perspectives may be some of the most valuable tools we have for navigating the future. And the story is still changing. Every year, new discoveries peel back another layer of the darkness covering that missing 95%. A fragment of bone in a Siberian cave reveals a child with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. A footprint in hardened mud rewrites the date humans reached the Americas. A tiny flake of obsidian turns up hundreds of miles from its source, proving that ancient trade routes were far more extensive than we thought. The picture is never finished. What you heard 10 years ago about human origins is already out of date. What we think tonight will probably seem naive in another generation, but that uncertainty is part of the magic. Our ancestors spent countless nights like this one, staring into embers, listening to stories that tried to explain where they came from and how the world worked. Thunder spirits, sky rivers, animal ancestors walking out of caves of light. Their stories were not less true than ours, just told with different tools. Now we have genetics, archaeology, climate modelling, and satellite imagery. We can watch the shadows of vanished rivers across desert sands. We can reconstruct the faces of individuals who died 40,000 years ago. We can trace a single mutation, a fused chromosome, through every living human and back into the bottleneck that nearly erased us. But we're still doing the same thing. We're still trying to answer the same questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What kind of beings are we really? When you look at our deep past, some answers stand out. We are survivors, yes, but not just because we're tough. We survived because we cooperated, because we shared information, because we cared what happened to one another. Genes favoured not just strength, but empathy. Not just quick reflexes, but the ability to sit around a fire and listen, remember, and pass wisdom to the next generation. If you feel a quiet longing for community, for shared meals, for conversations that last late into the night, that's not nostalgia for some recent golden age. It's your ancient programming, remembering how things were for almost all of human time. You're the child of people who gathered to watch the firelight flicker on the walls of caves, who tracked the stars to know when the rains would come, who learned to read a landscape the way we now read words on a screen. People who survived not by conquering everything, but by learning how to belong somewhere. As you drift towards sleep, you're not just a solitary, modern person with a busy mind. You're a continuation of that long, fragile, astonishing line. The bottleneck survivors, the Ice Age hunters, the artists of Lascaux and Sulawesi, the travellers who walked out of Africa and never stopped. Their struggles live in your stress. Their resilience lives in your ability to adapt. Their need for connection lives in your loneliness and your love. Remembering them isn't just about the past. It's about giving your present a context big enough to hold it. Because once you know that almost everything that makes you human was forged long before civilization, you can stop expecting cities, screens and schedules to satisfy needs they were never designed to satisfy. You can look for older solutions, slower rhythms, smaller circles of trust, more time under open sky. You can treat the earth not as a resource you stand above, but as the same living system that once almost killed your ancestors, and then, slowly, mercifully, let them live, and you can listen to the quiet voices in science, in indigenous traditions, in your own body, that are all saying the same thing. We've been here before. We know how to live through crisis. We know how to endure. We just have to remember. So here you are. After a journey that's taken you across more than 100,000 years of human time, across deserts and ice sheets, across narrow sea crossings in the dark, across campfires that burned out 40,000 years ago, but still glow in your imagination. You've walked alongside people who never heard the word civilization, but who knew the night sky better than most of us ever will. You've stood in caves lit only by flickering fire, watching someone grind red ochre into powder, press their hand against the rock and leave a print that says, "I was here, I existed, remember me." The truth is, we did, because that hand, that mind, that life did not vanish. It continued, through a chain of parents and children stretching across millennia, all the way down to you, lying here now, listening in the dark. Every story in this series, the bottleneck survivors, the first artists, the Ice Age hunters, the voyagers crossing into new continents, the quiet philosophers staring into the flames and wondering what comes after death. They're not strangers. They're chapters in a biography you inherited at birth. When they looked up, they saw the same constellations you see now. Orion, the Pleiades, the band of the Milky Way like a pale river across the sky. They told stories about those lights, stories of animals and heroes and spirits, of worlds beneath the earth and paths through the stars. We don't know the exact words anymore, but the impulse behind them, the need to explain, to imagine, to belong to something bigger that never went away. It lives in science. It lives in religion. It lives in the simple human act of telling each other stories before sleep. So as you drift off, you can picture them. A small ring of people huddled around a fire, sparks lifting into the night like tiny stars trying to return to the sky. Children leaning against their parents, eyes heavy, listening to tales of long journeys and great animals and mysterious dreams. Someone adding another stick to the fire, someone sharpening a tool, someone just staring into the embers, lost in thought. And now, you. Different clothes, different world, but the same nervous system humming, the same ancient brain settling as the light dims, the same soft pull of sleep coming on as a voice in the dark tells you about where you came from. You are part of that unbroken line, genes that scrape through the worst climate crisis in our history, hands that remember, somewhere deep in their wiring, how to chip stone and tie knots and recognize edible plants, a mind shaped by 1,000,000 nights of storytelling, fear, wonder, and hope. When you close your eyes tonight, you're not just falling asleep in your own room. You're lying down beside those ancient campfires. You're listening to the wind in Paleolithic grasslands, to waves breaking on shores first touched by human feet. to the quiet breathing of people who had no idea what history was, because they were the ones creating it. If this journey helped you feel that connection to the deep past, to the long, patient story that made you, you can gently tap like on this video and subscribe so we can keep exploring these forgotten ages together. It helps more than you might think, and it tells the algorithm gods that you want more nights like this. I'd also love to know where you're listening from. A city glowing with electric light, a quiet town, a countryside where the stars still cut through the dark. Leave a comment if you'd like, and share your thoughts, your favourite moment from this journey, or just the place on earth where you're falling asleep tonight. If you feel called to support this work in a deeper way, you can join our channel membership here on YouTube. It's completely optional. These stories will always be free to watch, and you're just as welcome here whether you join or not. But if you choose to, you help keep this long conversation with the past alive. For now, there's nothing you need to do. The hard part, surviving ice ages, crossing oceans, outlasting near extinction, that was done for you long ago. Your ancestors paid that price in full. Your task tonight is simpler. Breathe. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the images of stone tools and cave paintings and ancient migrations fade into softer shapes. The same stars that watched over every hunter, every gatherer, every wanderer are still shining above you now, even if you can't see them through the roof, even if city lights hide them from view. They're there. They've always been there. And somewhere, in the deep architecture of your mind, those old fires are still burning. Those old stories are still being told. So rest now. You're the latest dream of 100,000 years of human nights. Let their courage, their curiosity, their quiet persistence carry you gently into sleep. We'll meet them again in the next story. But for tonight, just drift and dream with your ancestors.